Modern Acadians carry a DNA signature so distinct, so internally concentrated, that geneticists immediately recognize it as something that evolved in isolation. Not for a generation or two, for over a century. Cut off from Europe, intermarrying within a tiny founding pool, and quietly absorbing indigenous ancestry that official records worked hard to erase. Two discoveries sit at the heart of this story. First, that every modern Acadian traces back to just 37 founding families, creating one of the most extreme genetic bottleneck ever documented in a European-descended population. Second, that by the time the British came to destroy them, somewhere between a quarter and a third of Acadians carried Mi'kmaq ancestry that the Catholic Church had systematically hidden for generations. The Acadians were never simply French colonists transplanted to the New World. They had become something else entirely, and their DNA proves it. The year is 1604. A small wooden vessel pushes into the Bay of Fundy on the northeastern edge of North America. Aboard are roughly 80 French settlers, not soldiers, not aristocrats, not missionaries seeking glory or governors seeking power. Farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, people who had spent their entire lives owning nothing in a country where land and status were inherited, never earned. They were looking for something Europe couldn't give them. A place to start over. They called their settlement Acadia. The name itself is disputed. It may derive from the Mi'kmaq word Algatig, meaning camping place, or from Arcadia, the mythical Greek paradise of peace and plenty. Either way, the name fit. What they built here, slowly and quietly over the next century and a half, would become something genuinely extraordinary. One detail that tends to get overlooked. These settlers arrived 1 year before Jamestown, 4 years before Quebec. Acadia was not a footnote to North American colonial history. It was the beginning of it. But what made Acadia different from every other European colonial project wasn't timing. It was what happened after the ships stopped coming. After 1654, as control of the region passed back and forth between France and Britain through a series of distant wars, immigration from France virtually ceased. The founding families, approximately 76 in total by most historical estimates, were left largely alone. No fresh arrivals from the old country. No new blood. No outside orders they felt compelled to follow. Just the land, the tides, the brutal maritime winters, and each other. That isolation was the starting point for everything that followed. Genetically, culturally, and socially, Acadia began evolving the moment Europe stopped paying attention. In 2018, geneticist Dr. Marie-Claire Arsenault published the results of a study that had taken years to complete. 3,000 Acadian volunteers, DNA samples drawn from communities scattered across maritime Canada, Louisiana, and New England. The goal was to map the genetic landscape of a population that had always claimed to be something distinct. What she found was more extreme than anyone had anticipated. Every single one of those 3,000 individuals could trace their ancestry back to just 37 core founding families. Names like LeBlanc, Hébert, Thibodeau, and Melanson. Surnames that still dominate Acadian communities today, nearly 4 centuries later. The genetic pool hadn't just narrowed over time, it had locked itself into place within the first 2 generations and barely shifted since. This is what geneticists call a founder effect. When a small, isolated population reproduces with minimal outside input, rare genetic variants stop being rare. They spread. They become defining features of that population, markers that exist nowhere else at the same frequency. The numbers are striking. Mitochondrial haplogroup H, which represents roughly 40% of European maternal lineages broadly, reaches 51% in Acadians. But it isn't just the frequency that's unusual, it's the specific subclades. Variants like H1C1 and H1E1A are virtually absent in modern France. In Acadian populations, they appear at frequencies of 3 to 5%. These aren't French signatures. They are Acadian signatures. The Y chromosome data is even more precise. While 58% of French men carry haplogroup R1b, among Acadians it reaches 73%. One specific subclade, R1b U106, stands at just 6% in France. Among Acadians, it reaches 15%. Geneticists traced every instance back to a single man. Antoine Blévin, who stepped off a ship in 1650 and never left. This DNA profile does not exist in France. It exists only here. The French ancestry explains part of what makes Acadian DNA unusual, but only part. Here is what the official records never wanted documented. By 1755, when the British began rounding up Acadian communities for deportation, approximately 30% of the Acadian population carried indigenous ancestry. 1 in 3. Hidden in plain sight for generations, buried under French baptismal names and carefully maintained parish records. The Catholic Church was meticulous about documentation. Births, marriages, deaths, all recorded with precision. But when Mi'kmaq women converted to Catholicism and married French settlers, the Church simply assigned them French names and recorded them as French. Their origins disappeared on paper. The indigenous ancestry was administratively erased. The DNA couldn't be erased. Mitochondrial haplogroup A2, a marker found exclusively in indigenous American populations, appears in 4% of modern Acadians, always through the maternal line. That's not noise. That's generations of French men marrying Mi'kmaq women, quietly, consistently, across more than a century of cohabitation. Haplogroup X2A, another indigenous marker, appears in 2% of Acadians, concentrated specifically in families from regions where French and Mi'kmaq cooperation was historically strongest. Ancient DNA from pre-deportation cemeteries confirmed what the living population suggested. Skeletons excavated from the Port Royal Cemetery, dating between 1650 and 1750, show indigenous ancestry reaching 40% in some communities. The intermarriage wasn't occasional. In certain areas, it was the norm. A secret letter written in 1753 by Catholic priest Pierre Maillard to the Bishop of Quebec makes the cover-up explicit. "Half the children I baptize have the features of savages," he wrote, "but we record them as French to avoid scandal." This wasn't incidental mixing. The Mi'kmaq women who married into Acadian families brought irreplaceable knowledge, medicinal plants, food preservation techniques for brutal winters, understanding of tidal patterns that made the famous Acadian dike system possible. French engineering, combined with Mi'kmaq environmental expertise, built the most productive farmland in the region. By 1755, the Acadians weren't French colonists with some indigenous contact. They were genuinely hybrid people, and their DNA has remembered that truth for 270 years. By 1750, Acadia was not a French colony in any meaningful sense. It hadn't been for generations. What the founding families had built over a century and a half of isolation was something that had no real equivalent anywhere in the colonial world. No nobility, no serfdom, no rigid class hierarchy imported from Europe and maintained through force. Communities governed themselves through elected assemblies, making collective decisions through consensus rather than decree. This was happening decades before the American Revolution made such ideas fashionable, in a corner of North America that Europe had largely forgotten about. Women could own property. Indigenous peoples were treated as social equals within the community, provided they converted to Catholicism. Wealth gaps between families were minimal by the standards of any society in the 1700s. The Acadians had built something genuinely egalitarian, not as a political ideology, but simply as a practical way of surviving together in an isolated and demanding landscape, and they had developed a political position to match: neutrality. When Britain gained control of mainland Acadia through the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, Acadians refused both unconditional loyalty to the British Crown and voluntary exile. They offered a third option. They would be loyal to Britain, but would never take up arms against France or their Mi'kmaq allies. For 40 years, British governors reluctantly accepted this arrangement, but British officials never stopped resenting it. Governor Lawrence wrote to London in 1754 with barely concealed fury. These French inhabitants possess the best and largest tracts of land in this province. They are a perpetual nest of spies. What Lawrence's letter reveals between the lines is the actual threat. The Acadians hadn't rebelled. They had simply proved that a self-sufficient, self-governing society could exist entirely outside British control. That was unforgivable. On September 5, 1755, British Colonel John Winslow stood at the altar of the church at Grand Pre and read a deportation order to 418 Acadian men and boys he had locked inside under false pretenses. Your lands, your cattle, your livestock are forfeited to the Crown. You yourselves are to be removed from this province. The deportation began immediately. Official British records state that approximately 7,000 Acadians were deported, and that casualties were relatively limited. For over 2 centuries, that number went largely unchallenged. Then the genetic modeling began. Pre-deportation church records and land surveys suggest the actual Acadian population stood at between 18,000 and 20,000, not the 13,000 Britain officially acknowledged. The missing thousands were never counted because Britain had no interest in documenting the full scale of what it was doing. Genetic modeling based on modern Acadian populations suggests between 8,000 and 10,000 Acadians dead during the deportation and its immediate aftermath. Ships were deliberately overcrowded. Food and water were deliberately restricted. British correspondence is explicit. The more that die in passage, the fewer we must settle elsewhere. The ship Duke William carried 364 Acadians toward France. It sank in a storm. Every person aboard died. No investigation followed. No consequences were assigned. The system was functioning exactly as intended. The survivors who eventually reached Louisiana carried the genetic damage of that crossing with them. Dr. Arsenault's study found that Louisiana Cajuns show 35% less genetic diversity than maritime Acadians. Each death at sea, each starvation in a hostile colony, each family separated and never reunited, removed genetic lineages permanently. The isolated community of Sethikamp, founded in 1785 by returning deportees, descended from just 7 families. Today, retinitis pigmentosa affects 1 in 27 Sethikamp residents. The global rate is 1 in 4,000. The deportation didn't just scatter people, it rewrote their DNA. Not every Acadian walked onto those ships. Thousands refused. They vanished into the forests and marshlands they had spent generations learning to navigate, guided by Mack allies who knew every hidden inlet and winter trail in the region. The British called them fugitives. History largely forgot them. They called themselves les Acadians cachés, the hidden Acadians. Survival required total erasure. They changed their surnames to English or Scottish ones. They stopped speaking French in public. They married into surrounding communities, quietly dissolving the visible markers of an identity that had become dangerous to claim. Within a generation, most of them had no official trace of Acadian origin anywhere in the documentary record. But they couldn't change their DNA, and that's where the genetic detective work becomes genuinely remarkable. Researchers mapping Acadian genetic markers began finding them in places where, according to every official record, no Acadians had ever lived. In Newfoundland, 15% of the population carries identifiable Acadian genetic signatures. In Cape Breton, families bearing Scottish surnames like White and Smith show unmistakable Acadian Y chromosome lineages running directly through the paternal line. The most dramatic discovery came from the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia and North Carolina. Isolated communities there had long puzzled historians. They preserved fragments of French-influenced folk songs. They cooked dishes no one could fully explain. Local oral traditions whispered about mysterious origins that mainstream history dismissed as folklore. The DNA settled the question. These mountain communities carry strong, clear, Acadian genetic signatures. They were hidden Acadians who had walked south and kept walking until they found somewhere remote enough to disappear. The oral histories were right all along. Historians were wrong. Thousands more Acadians survived than official records have ever acknowledged. They simply stopped being Acadian to do it. The genetic evidence is now beyond serious dispute. Modern Acadians carry a DNA profile unlike any other European-descended population on Earth. The founder effect is documented. The indigenous admixture is documented. The deliberate erasure of both, through falsified church records and administrative renaming, is documented. What remains unresolved is what any of it means legally and politically. The modern Acadian identity debate centers on a question that sounds academic but carries enormous practical weight. Are Acadians simply French Canadians who happen to live in maritime Canada? Or are they a distinct ethnic group shaped by a unique history and a measurably unique genetic profile, deserving of separate recognition? Acadian activists make a pointed argument. The Métis, Canada's mixed Indigenous and European population, hold constitutional recognition as a distinct people. They have land rights, self-governance protections, and a legal identity separate from both their European and Indigenous ancestors. The genetic case for Acadian distinctness is, by any measurable standard, comparable. 150 years of isolation, Significant indigenous admixture, a DNA signature that doesn't exist in France or anywhere else. If that argument prevails, the consequences are substantial. Distinct ethnic recognition could open the door to land rights claims on territories seized during and after the deportation, self-governance discussions, and formal reparations for one of the most methodically documented ethnic cleansings in North American history. The Canadian government has shown no appetite for opening that door. There is also a deep irony at the center of this debate. The Catholic Church, the same institution that spent generations hiding Indigenous marriages in falsified parish records, later turned around and actively suppressed Acadian identity in favor of a unified French-Canadian nationalism. Bishops discouraged use of the term Acadian entirely. Distinctive Acadian customs and vocabulary were dismissed as corrupted French that needed to be abandoned. Science has now overtaken politics. DNA has documented what institutions spent centuries trying to conceal. The record exists. The question is whether anyone in power is willing to read it honestly. Think back to that researcher staring at results that didn't fit any clean category. French, but not quite. European, but carrying markers that trace back to Mi'kmaq. Women whose names were erased from every official record. A population that shouldn't be genetically distinct, according to the documents, but unmistakably is. Two things created that distinctness. 37. Founding families reproduced in near total isolation for over a century, concentrating rare genetic variants into a signature found nowhere else on Earth. And a quiet, persistent, deliberately hidden intermarriage with indigenous peoples that the Catholic Church recorded over with French names and colonial silence. Together, those two forces built a people. Then the British tried to destroy those people. They scattered them across a continent, sank their ships, separated their families, and rewrote the population count to hide the scale of the killing. But they couldn't erase the DNA. It survived in Newfoundland fishing villages, in Appalachian mountain communities, in Louisiana bayous, in Cape Breton, families who forgot they were ever Acadian. The genes remembered. Ancient DNA research in this region is still developing. More hidden communities almost certainly remain to be found. More suppressed histories wait inside the biology of people who have no idea what their ancestors survived.